November 18, 2016. The small town of Lithonia, Georgia is buzzing with excitement, getting ready for the Thanksgiving holiday.
Lithonia is a city here on the outskirts of Atlanta.
Lithonia is located in the unincorporated part of DeKalb County. It is middle income, mostly hardworking people.
It's definitely a family town. It gives a little bit of big city with down home vibe at the same time. Lots of great eateries, great schools.
At 11:30 a.m., a local hotel is preparing for the influx of customers they get every year around the holiday season.
Employees at the hotel was going about their routine of the day, cleaning rooms, getting them ready for incoming customers.
A housekeeper was assigned to clean up room 207. She knocked on the door.
Housekeeping.
There was no answer. She again called out, housekeeping.
Housekeeping.
No one answered.
At that time, they didn't necessarily find it suspicious.
There wasn't a do not disturb sign on the door or anything like that, so she assumed the person staying there was out for the day.
The housekeeper uses her master key to enter the room for its routine cleaning. But she's surprised to see it isn't empty after all.
When she entered the room, she saw a young black female on her knees, face down on the bed.
As she gets closer, she notices that her hands and her feet are bound.
She appeared to be zip-tied in the back, and she realized that she was deceased.
She was shocked and ran out of the room, screaming for her manager.
Help! Help!
DeKalb County Police are immediately dispatched to the scene.
I walked into the room with another detective. I didn't see any blood around her body, but it looked like she had been suffocated. There was a black bandana in her mouth.
Possible asphyxiation for cause of death.
And as investigators continue their review of the crime scene, they find another piece of evidence that makes their hearts sink.
Detective, take a look at this.
On the table that housed the TV, there was a picture taken, a sonogram of an expected mother.
It said she was 9 weeks pregnant. And in the corner of the ultrasound, there was the name Ashley Mays.
Born and raised in Lithonia, 20-year-old Ashley Mays had a personality that was nothing short of magnetic.
Ashley was an amazing young woman, charismatic, friendly, just pure joy to be around.
Ashley was a ball of light, full of energy, just sharing her love with everybody. She loved dancing.
Any opportunity she had, she was somewhere dancing, enjoying the music, taking pictures, living life. She was the life of the party.
Ashley's good looks and larger-than-life personality meant she didn't have trouble attracting potential boyfriends.
Ashley met Stephen McBride in her senior year of high school.
They fall hard. They had some pretty heavy feelings very, very quickly, especially for her to be so young.
They were really cute together.
It wasn't soon after they got together that Ashley found herself pregnant.
Wow, you're pregnant?
Mm-hmm.
You think we're ready for this?
You know, there's lots of concerns about, is he ready? Am I ready? Although they knew they wanted a family together, they didn't anticipate it being so soon.
I really think we can make it work, Stephen.
Well, if you're happy, then I'm happy.
Fortunately enough, Stephen was supportive. He was as present as he could be.
Even though they were young, they were in love and they were happy to take this next step in their life.
They both graduated from high school, and in 2013, their baby boy was born.
But shortly before the birth of their son, tragedy struck.
Stephen, he was murdered due to senseless gun violence. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, which happens a lot in Atlanta, unfortunately.
This completely shattered Ashley's world. He was her first love. He was the father of their child. She just had a baby. I mean, this just rocked her world as she knew it.
She has now just dealt with the death of her significant other, the father of her child, and dealing with the financial uncertainty that comes with raising a baby. It's expensive.
And eventually, the pressure became too much.
Ashley ended up checking herself into a homeless shelter.
Her son lived with relatives while Ashley worked to get back on her feet.
Her family tried to help her out to the best of their abilities. However, Ashley wanted to do it on her own. She wanted her son to be able to be proud of her.
The people that were staying there, they all just loved her so much.
Miss Ida, do you have a blanket?
No, I'll be all right.
No, I have an extra one you can borrow.
Oh, thank you, honey.
Yeah, of
Thank
course,
you
of
so
course.
much.
This wasn't an ideal situation. And yet, Ashley made the most of the situation. She became a light to the other residents and even the staff at this local shelter.
She really felt like it was important for her to make a way for herself and really lean on herself and become the woman that she wanted to be.
So how did Ashley end up dead in a local hotel room?
Her positioning and what was done to her was a red flag to me that this was serious. I mean, they're all serious, don't get me wrong about that, but this screamed predator to me.
This wasn't the first time he'd done something like this.
I knew it was going to happen again, and we needed to stop it.
In the fall of 2016, 20-year-old Ashley Mays was still trying to move forward from a tragic loss.
The death of her boyfriend, Steven, took a huge toll on her. He was her first love and the father of her son.
In today's society, it's extremely difficult to manage a household with two parents. Ashley was a single parent. There are lots of challenges as it related to income, job, housing, transportation, daycare.
After sending her son to stay with relatives, Ashley had moved into a local homeless shelter until she could get back on her feet.
While living in the homeless shelter, Ashley was still bringing joy to the other people.
But now, Ashley's lifeless body has been discovered tied up in a Lithonia hotel room.
It appeared as though she had been suffocated because there was a black bandana still in her throat.
According to an ultrasound photo investigators found inside her hotel room, Ashley was 9 weeks pregnant at the time of her death.
For her to totally be disregarded and to be used and abused in such a way, it was disheartening.
For DeKalb County Police, finding Ashley's killer is a top priority.
While CSI was processing the scene, I went down to the manager's office.
Excuse me, I was hoping you could show us your security cam footage.
Yeah, of course. Just go ahead and come around and I'll show you. Here it is right here.
The footage shows Ashley arriving at the hotel around 7 a.m. that morning.
They saw Ashley go into the room after checking in, and then a male approached the room.
He was a black male, kind of chunky. He had a pair of dark jeans. He had a green jacket with an American flag on the back. He had a beard and he had gold-rimmed glasses on.
They saw the male enter the room and leave approximately 40 minutes later.
Nothing about his demeanor said that suspicious activity was happening. He was very calm.
The camera shows him leaving through the front parking lot.
Then he gets into his car.
The only thing that I could tell from the video is that it was a dark color Impala, older model.
Can you zoom in on the license plate anymore?
That's as far as it can go right there.
We could see where the license plate was, but the pixelation would not give us a number on the license plate.
Investigators' new priority is tracking down the driver of the dark-colored Impala.
Thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it.
To further their investigation, the detectives now took the description they had of both the person and the car, and they placed it on the media to look out for a dark-colored Impala.
As detectives wait for leads to come in, they review the results of Ashley's autopsy report.
The medical examiner was able to determine that she was strangled, and that was the cause of her death.
They also confirmed that she was indeed 9 weeks pregnant, just as the ultrasound photo described.
But that's not the only tragic news the medical examiner discovered.
The autopsy report also revealed that sadly Ashley had been raped by her killer.
The medical examiner was able to collect the killer's DNA from Ashley's body for testing. Once detectives locate their suspect, they'll be able to see if he's a match.
At this point, investigators had to look at whether the father of Ashley's unborn child could have been the same person who did this to her.
It sounds awful, but it's not uncommon for fathers to kill the mothers of the unborn baby to avoid having to pay child support.
Searching for the identity of the father of Ashley's unborn child, detectives touch base with Ashley's own father to see if he has any information.
I asked him to come to the office because I needed to sit down and talk to him.
I know this is difficult.
Still can't believe that she's gone.
Do you have any information about the pregnancy that might help us determine who did this to her?
Any information on the father?
No, I don't.
No one knew who the father was.
Not even Ashley.
As a homeless woman, Ashley was in a very vulnerable position. Unfortunately, homeless women are often targeted and sexually exploited.
Detectives must consider that Ashley's pregnancy wasn't something she chose.
Statistically, homeless women are 20% more likely to experience sexual assault.
And according to Ashley's father, she had begun working unconventional jobs to obtain the money she needed to get off the streets.
She just was so stubborn. She didn't want anybody to help her.
She had begun running escort services out of various websites. She didn't have any other forms of income. It's kind of a sad situation.
Those allegations raised immediate alarm. Sadly, sex work and sexual violence often go hand in hand.
I wasn't happy about it, but what can I do? She was so headstrong and determined.
Before detectives end their interview with Ashley's father, they have one more question for him.
Do you happen to recognize the man in this photo?
No, sir.
He had no idea who the man in the surveillance video could be.
Thanks for coming in. We'll be in touch.
Considering Ashley's involvement in sex work, detectives begin searching for more information on their victim and her recent contacts.
They discover that Ashley's telephone number is actually associated with an account on Backpage.com.
Backpage used to be very commonly used to trade sexual favors for money.
Could that be why Ashley was at the hotel that fateful night?
We knew that she was probably in that room prostituting.
Ashley was young and probably didn't realize the danger she was putting herself in by advertising on Backpage.
It's one of the worst examples of how the internet is used and how people are preyed upon.
There are real fears that this individual already has or will strike again.
And what investigators are about to discover will confirm those fears.
There's another victim.
She lived to tell the tale. Barely.
He said, if I had some alcohol, you'll be dead.
In the fall of 2016, Georgia detectives investigating the murder of 20-year-old Ashley Mays suspect her killer found her on Backpage.com after she posted an ad offering escort services.
At the time of her death, Ashley was a young, pregnant mother with no reliable sources of income. Unfortunately, women who turn to this line of work often fall victim to violence.
But is Ashley the only victim?
Whoever killed Ashley seemed experienced and came to that hotel with a premeditated plan.
Detectives realized that this may not be a first time for this suspect.
Detective Schuler. Oh, really?
Once we got back to the office, we started talking about the case. At that point, it was brought up that our special victims unit had worked a rape case the week prior.
And this incident had very eerie similarities to Ashley's case.
Black bandana, zip ties. Suspect was wearing a green jacket with an American flag on it. So at that point, we realized that these two cases were going to be related.
But unlike Ashley, this woman lived to tell the tale, barely. And the detectives want to talk to her as soon as possible.
Absolutely. Let's bring her in.
The victim, Raven Kyle, agrees to meet with the detectives working Ashley's case.
Raven is a young single mom. She has a post on Backpage where she exchanges her time for roses, which is code for money. She says on the morning of Friday, November 11th, she receives a message from a man offering to give her 100 roses for her time.
Did he ever give you a nickname or say his name?
He never said his name. He just...
When you talked to him on the phone, how did he introduce himself?
He never introduced himself.
Is that common?
Yeah.
Okay.
He asked for my address and I texted him the address and he came about 20 minutes later.
Raven says her client arrived just before 8 p.m.
He arrives in a dark Chevy Impala.
He walked into her townhouse, and at that point, she was assaulted.
I turned around, he had a gun. And I'm like, what do you want? I'll give you whatever you want.
He tied her with zip ties, the same as Ashley Mays.
He tied my arms behind my back and then he tied up my legs. He took the bandana out of his pocket and he shoved it in my mouth. He shoved it down my throat. And after that, he raped me.
But Raven's horrifying experience didn't end there.
He got the bleach out of my closet and he just started pouring it all over me.
He then asked her, "Do you have any alcohol?"
When you mix bleach and alcohol together, it creates chloroform. If inhaled, chloroform can be very deadly.
And I was like, no. He said, if I had some alcohol, you'll be dead.
Then he left her tied up.
She was able to free herself, ran out of her townhouse crying, screaming. Neighbors heard, came over and assisted and called 911.
She knows she's very lucky to be alive.
Raven describes her attacker as a large black male.
How heavy set or how skinny was he?
He was not skinny.
Not skinny?
The investigators show her the stills of the hotel surveillance.
Is this the guy that attacked you?
Yeah, that's him. That's him. Gold glasses, the black pants. That's him.
She unequivocally so was able to confirm it is the same person.
Before detectives conclude the interview, Raven provides another key piece of evidence.
Raven's attacker took 2 of her phones, but as it turns out, she had a third device that wasn't taken. And that device just happened to be the one that she was corresponding with him on.
Yeah, I do have the phone number.
She called that her work phone. So we were able to get the number that he contacted her from.
Detectives find the same number in the records they've obtained for Ashley's cell phone.
She had correspondence with his number just 1 hour before she was killed.
The women were strangers. There were no 2 calls from the same number, except for one.
So I knew that we were dealing with a good lead on who may have contacted these victims and then assaulted them.
We started sending subpoenas to try to get the identity of the owner of that phone number.
It's no easy task.
The phone provider was what we call a VoIP, or a voice over internet protocol device.
Unlike traditional mobile phones that use cell towers, VoIP devices make and receive calls using the internet. VoIP startup companies can and often go out of business, so users' numbers are frequently sold to other companies.
Those accounts usually get handed off several times. So you've got to follow the breadcrumb trail to get to the very last one.
Every new account requires another subpoena, and that takes time.
Time isn't what authorities have on their side right now.
We knew we had to catch him quickly, or it was going to keep going. It was going to keep escalating.
But on November 29th, investigators get a promising lead from an unlikely source, a low-level pimp named Corey Collins.
This person comes forward with yet another violent story.
Usually people that live that lifestyle don't want to have a ton of involvement with the police.
Like, I don't want to kill you, like, you better kill me.
He understood the significance of what had happened and what may happen again if we don't stop it.
In the fall of 2016, a string of violent attacks, including one that claimed the life of 20-year-old Ashley Mays, has authorities in Lithonia, Georgia, racing for answers.
There is evidence that would definitely indicate he is a predator and he would do this again.
Now investigators are speaking with a man who claims to have information on another violent assault.
Corey Collins was a low-level pimp in the area. He was afraid for his girl's safety after all the violence that had been plaguing the city's sex workers lately.
Usually people that live that lifestyle don't want to have a ton of involvement with the police. They want to handle their own business and move on to their next job. But he gave us information that really assisted us in solving this case. So he did a good thing.
Corey tells detectives that on November 13th, a man reached out on Backpage to enlist the services of one of his girls.
You ever talked to him before?
No.
Corey arranged for the date at a local hotel. He got 2 rooms side by side, just in case there was any funny business going on.
Minutes later, Corey, from his room, hears screams.
It was real loud, so I ran to swat the kid came in.
Yo, what the hell is going on here? I didn't do nothing.
He saw the victim with a black bandana in her mouth and she was bleeding. She was in an obvious struggle with this guy. This guy was in possession of a firearm.
We both had our guns on each other.
What did he say to you when you came in?
He was just looking scared. Then he was like, I didn't do nothing. She got the money.
And they kind of had about a 30-second standoff where they just stared at each other.
Yeah, he started backing up out the room. He was like, I don't want to kill you. Like, you better kill me.
But Corey knew he didn't need a murder on his hands.
He just kept backing up. And he was like, don't shoot me. All I mean, you better get some. The male is able to get outside the hotel room.
You better run!
The assailant fled the scene in a dark-colored sedan, just like the one police had on surveillance from Ashley Mace's murder.
Detectives know tracking down the suspect's dark-colored Impala is crucial to their investigation. But they soon receive an even more promising Crime Stoppers tip.
We got a call from a young lady who claimed to know the male that was responsible for these crimes.
She was another sex worker.
When I saw the Crime Stoppers alert, I just knew I needed to call in.
The woman tells detectives she knows someone who fits the description of the man police have been searching for.
His name is Trey Williams, and he has frequent interactions with the sex workers in town. He also drives a dark-colored Impala.
We talked to her, and she agreed to set up a date later that evening to kind of lure him into the apartment complex.
As night falls on Lithonia, police set up a stakeout.
Myself and Detective McQuilkin were at the location with uniformed officers.
When authorities see the Impala pull in, they take action.
That's him. Go, 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 go.
We initiated a traffic stop on him and took him into custody.
What's going on? You're under arrest.
I didn't do nothing.
Once Trey Williams is detained, detectives search his vehicle.
We processed the car first because we were looking for important evidence that we knew was stored in that car.
They found a bag full of condoms.
We did not find any zip ties or any black bandanas, but we did find personal information on various prostitutes in the area. He had actually graded them by service and how much they charged, and he had given them a ranking system.
Clearly, this man was interested in having lots of sex.
It was disturbing. He had an obsession with these women.
In the winter of 2016, police have Trey Williams in custody for the murder of Ashley Mays and the violent assaults of at least 2 other women.
He was an individual who would drive around looking for sex.
Inside Trey's vehicle, detectives find a notebook ranking the services of various escorts, as well as their personal information.
Surprisingly, Ashley and Raven weren't in the notebook, but dozens of other escorts were.
Once we processed his car, we went back to interview him at headquarters.
Someone is out there hurting these women.
That's what I hear.
Well, it's no coincidence you are sitting here.
It's not me.
Trey says that he is not a violent person and he simply likes to have a good time.
When they ask him about Ashley Mays, he denies knowing her or the other girls.
I'll admit I'm no saint, but I would never hurt a woman. You got the wrong guy.
But detectives are skeptical.
They asked him if he would agree to submit DNA samples, and he agreed.
Sure, take whatever you want.
The officers swabbed him for DNA.
They knew the DNA test would soon tell them the full story.
But when detectives receive the results of the DNA swab, they're stunned.
When they get the DNA results back, Trey is not a match.
Trey was not their man.
We thought we had the right guy. You get run around a lot, but that was a good false lead.
Detectives are now back at square one.
That means the success of this case now hinges on their remaining piece of key evidence: the suspect's phone records.
If authorities were going to solve this case, they had to find a way to identify the person that made the calls to these women on an internet phone.
After 3 days spent contacting various phone companies, investigators finally get a hit.
Oh, you got it? Great. It was Pinger. Pinger Inc. held the records. So I subpoenaed Pinger for the records for that phone number.
There's no name associated with the account. However, there is a username: Tariq Hall 1992.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I immediately assumed 1992 was a birth year, and I was able to quickly find a Tariq Hall with that birth year. I was also able to find a photograph of Mr. Hall, and when I looked at that photograph and compared it to what I had seen in the video from the hotel, I knew that we had the right person.
Detectives learn that Tariq works at a rapid transit company in Metro Atlanta.
Tariq Hall was a bus driver for their mobility services.
On November 29th, 2016, Tariq arrives at work in the same black Chevy Impala police have been searching for.
Once he arrived at work, we were able to take him into custody without incident.
Inside Tariq's vehicle, police locate a plethora of evidence.
We found several black bandanas that matched the previous crime scenes and zip ties that were already put together in a position to where they could be used as handcuffs very quickly.
Back at the station, detectives sit down with their new prime suspect.
I read him his Miranda rights, and he agreed to waive his rights and provide me with a statement.
Tariq also agreed to a DNA swab.
That's right there. Now, understanding the rights that we just talked about, do you want to talk to me about why you're up here?
Yeah.
So we had a lengthy conversation. I asked him about his involvement with young ladies that worked on Backpage. How often do you call girls on Backpage?
Not that often.
When they try to talk to him about the attack on Raven, he says he doesn't know anything about that.
He also denied knowing anything about the standoff at the hotel with Corey.
That's a long time ago. I can't remember back that far.
He would not answer any questions in reference to either case that we were talking about. He just had no memory.
When detectives mention Ashley's murder, Tariq again can't recall a thing.
To help jog Tariq's memory, detectives confront him with the hotel surveillance footage.
Look at me in the eye and tell me that's not you. Can't do it, man.
Tariq took no responsibility, even though the officer showed him his own picture.
Tariq was very cool, eerily cool, in the interrogation room.
The way you walked into that hotel room and the way you walked out, cool as a cucumber, man. It's like you've done this 100 times.
Tariq's demeanor showed a person who did not care about the life of anybody.
And detectives are getting frustrated with his nonchalant attitude.
I wasn't in there.
You were in the damn room, Tariq. Don't look at me like I'm stupid and tell me that you weren't in that room. All right? Don't disrespect me like that.
He seemed absolutely unbothered by any of the evidence that they were bringing against him.
You know where you up? Your cell phone. The email address you used to re-up? Tariq Hall, 1992. Then he just said, I don't want to answer any more questions. I need an attorney. So the interview's over.
So I'm a lawyer.
Okay, you need a lawyer? You need one. Trust me, you need one.
But when detectives subpoena the contents of Tariq's cell phone, they'll uncover even more chilling evidence against him.
I found images of our victim.
Tariq's a prime example of a sociopath.
This all seemed to be some sort of game to him.
Police have arrested 24-year-old bus driver Tariq Hall for the murder of Ashley Mays and assaults against 2 other women in the Atlanta area.
This is someone who is a predator, and from what I could tell, had been at it for a while and was not going to stop.
Tariq's cool as a cucumber demeanor, the way he did the whole interview with detectives, just shows that he is a cold-blooded killer who just has no remorse.
That's further confirmed when detectives scroll through the camera roll on Tariq's phone.
He had actually recorded a video of him watching our Crime Stoppers tip air on the news.
When a video closes, the only thing he says is, I can beat that.
Deeper in Tariq's camera roll is something even more chilling.
I found images of our victim Mays before and after she was killed.
This all seemed to be some sort of game to him, where maybe he even saw these women as being trophies.
There was no indication that he would have stopped, and I don't believe he would have.
However, the most damning evidence against Tariq is revealed when they compare his DNA with the foreign DNA collected from Ashley's body.
The nail in the coffin is results from the DNA test. It's an exact match.
There was a 1 in 10 sextillion chance that it was anybody else in the world. That's a big number.
Detective Schuler decides to personally inform Tariq of the news.
Well, how about this?
I just presented the DNA evidence, and Mr. Hall stated at that point, he said, "How good is DNA?" He said, is that good evidence?"
It's some of the best evidence there is.
At that point, I told him that he would never get out of jail because DNA is unbreakable evidence.
The DNA evidence is big enough to knock the fight right out of Tariq.
Okay. Okay.
He called his sister from the jail and said, "Don't worry about selling my car for an attorney. I'm not gonna need one. They got me."
Tariq admits he found Ashley on Backpage, and they agree to meet at the hotel for a rendezvous.
Hey, you Ashley?
Yeah, you got cash?
Yeah.
Come on in.
Immediately, Tariq brandished a gun, pulled it out.
Get on the bed.
Well, I don't do all that.
Get on the bed!
He made her lay down.
Please stop!
Shut up!
Next, he pulled zip ties out of his pocket and zip tied her hands and her feet behind her back.
He shoved a bandana in her mouth, just like he did with Raven, and snapped a few photos.
Then he had his way with her.
In the process, Tariq admits he strangled Ashley.
Once she was dead, he took more photos. I mean, this guy is completely sick.
Then he calmly walked out of the hotel.
Tariq, why? Why did you do it?
I don't know. I just lose control sometimes.
He essentially just had a fetish for violent sex and didn't care when it went too far.
People ask me why Ashley, why kill that one? And the way that I was told that Ashley was found, face down with her head buried in a pillow, tells me that Tariq was not going to let Ashley call out or draw attention. Like in the case of Raven, and I think that's why Ashley was the first one he killed that we know of. To be able to get this person off the street before he did it again was incredibly satisfying.
On October 4th, 2017, Tariq Hall pleads guilty to murder and rape charges.
He did not want to go to trial, so he pled to 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole.
1 life sentence for the murder of Ashley. Another life sentence for the rape of Raven.
Mr. Hall will end up dying in jail. He'll never get out.
At least this man is not on the streets anymore. He can't harm women.
However, the scars from Tariq's actions will remain with his other victims and Ashley's family for a lifetime.
Ashley's family has lost the light of their lives. They lost their daughter. Their siblings lost an older sister. But most importantly, there's now a young boy who will never know his mom.
And Ashley's unborn child, who was taken too soon.
It is my hope that Ashley's legacy will live on, that her story will help deter other young women from participating in some of the dangers in some of these dating websites.
Ladies, be careful. There are other ways to make money. Do not put yourself in a vulnerable position where someone can take your life.
Sexual assault is never okay. If you or someone you love has experienced sexual assault, there is help available. Call the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-HOPE.
In the early 1990s, Phoenix, Arizona was a city that seemed to promise endless sunshine and new beginnings. Every year, thousands of people arrived hoping to build quieter lives beneath its clear blue skies, surrounded by neighborhoods that stretched farther into the desert with every passing season. Palm trees lined freshly paved streets. Shopping centers appeared where open land had existed only months before. Families gathered in neighborhood parks, teenagers rode bicycles until dusk, and runners followed miles of concrete paths that traced the city's vast canal system. To most residents, those canals were little more than practical waterways carrying life across the desert. They were familiar landmarks, places where people exercised, walked their dogs, or escaped the heat after sunset. But landscapes often keep secrets longer than people do. As daylight faded each evening, the bright colors of Phoenix slowly dissolved into muted shades of gray and amber. Streetlights became less frequent along the canal paths. Long shadows stretched across the pavement. The steady rush of water below blended with the distant hum of traffic until the city itself seemed far away. A cyclist could travel for miles without passing another person. The isolation felt peaceful to some. To someone else, it represented opportunity. Long before anyone had a name for the killer, before detectives filled evidence rooms with photographs and reports, before television stations warned viewers to stay away from the canals after dark, there were only unanswered questions. Women disappeared into ordinary evenings that should have ended with familiar routines. Families waited for phone calls that never came. Friends assumed someone had simply decided to stay out late. Hours turned into panic, and panic slowly transformed into the unbearable realization that something far darker had interrupted lives that only moments earlier had seemed completely ordinary. For years, those questions echoed through Phoenix without answers. Police officers investigated every lead they could find. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people. Crime laboratories preserved every piece of evidence they believed might someday matter. Yet every effort seemed to end in another locked door. Technology had not yet caught up with the mystery waiting inside the evidence lockers. The city continued to grow while the investigation stood almost perfectly still. Time, however, has an unusual relationship with truth. Sometimes it buries it. Sometimes it protects it. And sometimes, after decades of silence, it finally forces it into the light. The story of the man who would eventually become known across America as the Canal Killer is not simply the story of two murders. It is a story about patience measured not in weeks or months but in decades. It is about investigators who refused to let forgotten files collect dust forever. It is about families who continued living with empty spaces at dinner tables while hoping that one day a telephone call would finally deliver the answer they had waited most of their lives to hear. It is also a story that reminds us how ordinary appearances can become the most convincing disguise. For more than 20 years, the man at the center of this investigation did not vanish into another country. He did not isolate himself in some remote cabin. He did not spend his life constantly looking over his shoulder. Instead, he lived openly among neighbors. He attended public events. He laughed with strangers. He posed for photographs. Children smiled beside him. Police officers occasionally smiled beside him as well, never imagining that the man standing comfortably within arm's reach had remained hidden from one of Arizona's most haunting homicide investigations. That contradiction would later shock an entire nation. But in the beginning, no one knew his name. They knew only fear. Fear has a remarkable ability to reshape a city. At first, it spreads quietly, almost invisibly. A conversation between co-workers. A warning passed from one neighbor to another. Parents begin insisting their daughters arrive home before sunset. Friends stop jogging alone. Cyclists choose different routes. Small changes accumulate until routines that once felt effortless become careful calculations of risk. Phoenix experienced exactly that transformation. The canal paths had once represented freedom. They became places people hurried through instead of lingering. Every unfamiliar face attracted longer glances. Every delayed arrival inspired worry. Every unanswered telephone call seemed capable of carrying devastating news. Yet fear alone could not solve the mystery. Investigators needed evidence. Evidence, unfortunately, was painfully limited. There were no surveillance cameras recording quiet stretches of canal trails in the early 1990s. Mobile phones capable of revealing someone's last known location still belonged largely to science fiction. Digital footprints did not exist. Witnesses often remembered only fragments. Darkness concealed details. Rain, wind, passing vehicles, and time itself slowly erased whatever traces remained. Still, detectives refused to stop searching. Every report was typed. Every photograph was catalogued. Every interview became another page inside expanding case files that would eventually occupy shelves filled with unanswered questions. Some officers retired before learning whether their work had mattered. Others passed the investigation to younger detectives who inherited not only the files but also the frustration that accompanied them. They all shared one belief. Someone had committed these crimes. Someone had walked away. Someone still knew the truth. What none of them could have predicted was that science itself would eventually become their newest detective. Decades after the crimes, techniques unimaginable during the original investigation would begin transforming criminal investigations around the world. Tiny biological traces once considered scientifically useless suddenly became powerful witnesses. A microscopic fragment preserved inside sealed evidence could speak more clearly than fading memories ever could. The passage of time, which once seemed like the investigation's greatest enemy, slowly became its greatest ally. But reaching that point required extraordinary patience. Before laboratories could unlock answers hidden inside DNA, before investigators devised elaborate undercover operations, before courtroom testimony finally placed a name beside years of unanswered questions, there were families forced to endure birthdays, holidays, anniversaries, and ordinary mornings overshadowed by extraordinary loss. No scientific breakthrough could ever restore what had been taken from them. Justice, when it eventually arrived, would never erase grief. It could only acknowledge it. This case also illustrates another uncomfortable reality about violent offenders. Popular imagination often expects monsters to look unmistakably different from everyone else. Society searches for visible warning signs, dramatic behavior, or obvious isolation. Real life is frequently less reassuring. Some offenders succeed precisely because they appear ordinary enough to escape suspicion. They hold conversations. They maintain routines. They participate in community events. They become familiar faces whose presence rarely invites concern. That illusion can endure for years. Sometimes for decades. The investigation that eventually identified Brian Patrick Miller challenged many assumptions about how long dangerous individuals can remain hidden in plain sight. It demonstrated both the limitations of criminal investigations during one era and the remarkable capabilities that modern forensic science would later provide. It also became one of the most significant examples of how advances in genetic genealogy could breathe life into cases once considered permanently unsolved. Yet before the headlines, before the courtroom proceedings, before the scientific breakthroughs that would make international news, there were simply two young women whose lives ended far too soon, leaving families forever divided into two chapters, life before loss and life after it. Their stories deserve to be remembered not because of the man eventually convicted of killing them, but because they were daughters, sisters, friends, classmates, and people whose futures extended far beyond the final days that came to define public memory. This documentary is not intended to glorify violence or elevate the man responsible. Instead, it follows the long and difficult pursuit of truth, examining how determined investigators, evolving forensic science, and the unwavering persistence of grieving families eventually brought resolution to one of Arizona's longest-running homicide investigations. It is a story about justice delayed, about evidence waiting silently for technology to catch up, and about the extraordinary patience required when the truth refuses to reveal itself quickly. Some mysteries disappear into history. Others wait. This was one of the mysteries that waited more than 2 decades before finally speaking. And when it did, it revealed a truth that was every bit as unsettling as the silence that had hidden it for so many years. By the early 1990s, Phoenix had become one of the fastest-growing cities in the United States. New neighborhoods spread steadily into the surrounding desert, bringing thousands of new residents each year. The city's rapid expansion created a sense of opportunity. Families arrived looking for affordable homes, young professionals sought new careers, and retirees were drawn by the warm climate and relatively quiet pace of life. Running through much of the metropolitan area was an extensive network of irrigation canals. Originally constructed to support agriculture in the arid Southwest, these waterways had gradually become part of everyday urban life. Concrete maintenance roads beside the canals evolved into popular paths for walking, jogging, and cycling. During daylight hours, they were busy with commuters, exercise enthusiasts, and families enjoying the outdoors. After sunset, however, the atmosphere changed dramatically. Large sections of the canal system had limited lighting. Long stretches were bordered by vegetation, retaining walls, or open ground with few nearby homes. While many residents continued to use the paths in the evening, visibility was often poor, and opportunities for assistance could be limited if someone encountered trouble. At the time, few people viewed the canals as dangerous. They were simply another part of the city. Law enforcement agencies in Phoenix faced the same challenges confronting many growing American cities during that era. Population growth placed increasing demands on police resources. Investigators handled a wide range of violent crimes, property offenses, and traffic incidents while forensic science remained far less advanced than it is today. DNA profiling was still a relatively new investigative tool. Although its potential was already recognized, the technology required larger biological samples, took considerably longer to process, and could not be compared against the extensive databases that investigators rely on today. Many cases depended primarily on eyewitness testimony, fingerprints, physical evidence, and traditional detective work. Those limitations would later become critically important. The investigation that would eventually become known as the Canal Killer case began with what appeared, at first, to be an isolated homicide. Detectives treated it with the seriousness expected of any major violent crime, carefully documenting the scene, collecting available evidence, and interviewing potential witnesses. Despite those efforts, the available evidence presented immediate obstacles. There were no reliable eyewitnesses who had observed the attack itself. There was no surveillance footage. There was no obvious suspect. Investigators preserved every piece of forensic evidence they could recover, understanding that scientific advances might someday provide answers unavailable at the time. That decision would ultimately prove invaluable, although no one involved could have predicted how long the wait would be. As months passed, the investigation continued without a breakthrough. Detectives followed numerous leads, eliminated individuals who appeared promising as suspects, and coordinated with forensic specialists whenever new analytical techniques became available. Then another violent crime occurred. The similarities between the two investigations immediately attracted attention. Detectives compared crime scene evidence, victimology, timelines, and forensic findings. As laboratory analysis progressed, evidence indicated that both crimes had been committed by the same individual. For investigators, this changed everything. The city was no longer dealing with a single unsolved homicide. It was searching for an unidentified serial offender. Public awareness increased as local media reported on the investigation. Residents who regularly exercised along the canal paths became more cautious. Some altered their routines, avoided traveling alone after dark, or selected different locations altogether. Meanwhile, detectives expanded their efforts. Thousands of tips were reviewed. Potential suspects were interviewed. Known violent offenders were examined. Individuals whose backgrounds appeared relevant voluntarily or pursuant to court orders provided DNA samples as investigative methods evolved. One by one, those leads failed to produce a match. Years became decades. Personnel changed. Case files grew larger. Yet the investigation remained active. Rather than abandoning the case, Phoenix investigators maintained the evidence under carefully controlled conditions. Advances in forensic science during the late 1990s and 2000s gradually improved the ability to analyze biological material. National DNA databases expanded, allowing comparisons against convicted offenders and other qualifying individuals. Still, no identification emerged. The absence of a database match suggested one of several possibilities. The offender might never have been required to submit DNA under existing laws. He might not have been convicted of qualifying offenses. Or he simply might not yet have come to the attention of investigators in a way that connected him to the preserved evidence. By the early 2010s, another scientific development began changing the landscape of cold case investigations: investigative genetic genealogy. Rather than searching directly for the offender, researchers could identify distant biological relatives through publicly available genetic information, then construct family trees that gradually narrowed the field of possible suspects. The method required careful legal review, extensive genealogical research, and traditional investigative work to confirm any conclusions. It was not a shortcut. It was a new tool that complemented decades of detective work rather than replacing it. For the Phoenix investigators who had inherited the Canal Killer case, it represented a new opportunity. The evidence collected many years earlier, carefully preserved despite repeated disappointments, would once again be examined using technologies that had not existed when the crimes occurred. The long wait for answers was entering a new chapter, one defined not by chance but by scientific progress and the determination of investigators who refused to allow the case to remain permanently unsolved. Long before their names became associated with one of Arizona's most enduring criminal investigations, Angela Brosso and Melanie Berners were known for something far more meaningful. They were daughters, sisters, classmates, co-workers, and friends. Their lives were defined not by the tragedy that ultimately brought them into the public eye, but by the ordinary ambitions and relationships that shape countless young lives. Remembering them as individuals rather than simply as victims is an essential part of understanding this case. Angela Brosso was 21 years old in November 1992. Friends and family described her as independent and optimistic, a young woman beginning to build her adult life. Like many people her age, she balanced work, friendships, and plans for the future. Those who knew her recalled someone who enjoyed spending time outdoors and appreciated the sense of freedom that came with riding her bicycle through familiar parts of Phoenix. The city itself encouraged that lifestyle. Evening bicycle rides along the canal paths were common, particularly during the cooler months when the desert heat gave way to comfortable temperatures after sunset. For many residents, these routes were part of everyday life rather than places associated with danger. There was little reason for Angela, or anyone else, to believe that an ordinary evening ride would become the focus of a major homicide investigation. The day before her 22nd birthday should have been filled with anticipation. Birthdays often serve as small milestones, moments when friends make plans, families prepare celebrations, and people reflect briefly on the year behind them before looking ahead to the next. Instead, those plans were interrupted. When Angela failed to return home, concern gradually replaced expectation. At first, loved ones likely searched for ordinary explanations. Perhaps she had stopped to visit someone. Perhaps she had experienced a mechanical problem with her bicycle. Perhaps there had simply been a misunderstanding about her schedule. As more time passed, those possibilities became increasingly difficult to believe. When authorities later confirmed that she had been killed, the loss extended far beyond the immediate family. Friends, co-workers, neighbors, and investigators were confronted with the reality that a young woman had lost her life during what should have been an entirely routine activity. The crime scene itself immediately indicated that investigators were dealing with an exceptionally serious and unusual homicide. Detectives carefully documented the available evidence while forensic specialists worked to preserve anything that might later assist the investigation. Despite those efforts, the available evidence offered few immediate answers. The lack of eyewitnesses presented a significant obstacle. There were no surveillance systems overlooking the canal paths, and forensic technology of the early 1990s had not yet reached the level that investigators would later come to rely upon. Even so, detectives preserved biological evidence with the understanding that future scientific advances might someday reveal information unavailable at the time. That decision would eventually become one of the most important aspects of the investigation. For Angela's family, however, scientific possibilities offered little comfort in the immediate aftermath of their loss. The investigation continued, but daily life had changed permanently. Every holiday, every birthday, and every family gathering would now include the absence of someone who should have been present. As investigators continued pursuing leads, the case remained unsolved. Then, less than a year later, another family found itself facing an unimaginable tragedy. Melanie Berners was 17 years old. She was still in high school and, like many teenagers, was looking toward adulthood with hopes that had yet to unfold. Teachers, classmates, relatives, and friends remembered a young person whose life had barely begun. Her disappearance in September 1993 immediately raised concerns. Unlike the first investigation, detectives now had recent experience with another homicide committed near the canal system. As information developed, investigators began comparing the circumstances surrounding both cases. The similarities demanded careful examination. Crime scene specialists reviewed forensic evidence. Detectives compared timelines. Laboratories analyzed preserved biological samples using the best technology then available. Eventually, forensic testing indicated that the same unknown individual was responsible for both crimes. This finding transformed two separate homicide investigations into the search for a serial offender. For the Berners family, the confirmation brought mixed emotions. Knowing that investigators had identified a connection represented progress, but it did not answer the most important question. Who was responsible? Nor did it lessen the grief experienced by those who had known Melanie throughout her short life. The emotional impact extended throughout the community. Parents became more cautious about allowing teenagers to travel alone after dark. Friends checked on one another more frequently. Activities that had once seemed routine suddenly required additional planning. The realization that two unrelated young women had been killed by the same unidentified individual created understandable anxiety across Phoenix. Investigators also recognized the implications. Serial homicide investigations differ significantly from isolated cases. Detectives must consider not only evidence connected to known victims but also the possibility that additional crimes may have occurred without being linked. As a result, law enforcement agencies began reviewing reports of missing persons, unsolved assaults, and other violent offenses to determine whether additional connections existed. Most potential links were eventually excluded through careful investigation. Others remained uncertain. Over time, investigators publicly acknowledged that while Brian Patrick Miller would ultimately be convicted only for the murders of Angela Brosso and Melanie Berners, detectives continued examining whether additional unsolved cases might somehow be connected. Those questions remain part of the broader historical record surrounding the investigation. Importantly, no additional homicide convictions have resulted from those inquiries. For the families of Angela and Melanie, however, public discussion about possible additional victims was always secondary to the memory of the people they had lost. The headlines often emphasized the nickname eventually assigned to the unidentified offender. The families emphasized something different. They wanted the public to remember Angela. They wanted the public to remember Melanie. Not as evidence in a criminal investigation. Not as names inside police reports. But as young women whose lives mattered long before they became part of one of Arizona's best-known cold cases. As the investigation entered its second year without an arrest, detectives understood that preserving every piece of evidence would be essential. They could not know when scientific advances might provide new opportunities. What they did know was that somewhere, an unidentified offender had escaped detection twice. Finding that individual would require persistence measured not in days or months, but eventually in decades. The answers the families sought would not come quickly. They would have to wait for science to catch up with the evidence that investigators had carefully preserved all along. The discovery that two separate homicide investigations were connected fundamentally changed the direction of the case. What had initially appeared to be isolated acts of violence was now understood to be the work of the same unknown offender. For investigators with the Phoenix Police Department, this realization brought both clarity and urgency. A serial offender, by definition, represented an ongoing public safety threat. Identifying that person became one of the department's highest priorities. The investigative team expanded. Experienced homicide detectives, forensic specialists, crime analysts, and prosecutors began working together to examine every available piece of evidence. Files from both investigations were reviewed repeatedly, often by different investigators looking for details that might have been overlooked during the original examinations. This process was painstaking. Every witness statement was compared against timelines. Every physical exhibit was catalogued again. Maps of the canal system were spread across conference tables as detectives looked for geographic patterns that might reveal something about the offender's movements or familiarity with the area. One conclusion emerged early. The offender appeared comfortable around the canal system. Whether that familiarity came from living nearby, working in the area, or spending significant time along the trails remained unknown. However, investigators believed the crimes demonstrated knowledge of locations where visibility was limited and where opportunities for intervention by other members of the public were relatively low. That assessment shaped future investigative strategies. Detectives began examining people whose employment, hobbies, or daily routines regularly brought them near the canal network. They reviewed criminal histories, interviewed individuals who had previously committed violent offenses, and sought information from members of the public. Tips arrived from many directions. Some callers believed they had seen suspicious vehicles. Others recalled unusual encounters that had seemed insignificant at the time but now appeared worth reporting. Every tip required evaluation. Most ultimately proved unrelated. Some consumed days or even weeks of investigative effort before being eliminated. Such outcomes are common in major homicide investigations. Following promising leads that later collapse is an unavoidable part of the process. Meanwhile, forensic scientists continued examining the biological evidence recovered during both investigations. Although DNA analysis was available in the early 1990s, its capabilities were considerably more limited than they are today. The testing methods required careful interpretation, and national databases containing offender DNA profiles were still developing. Even so, laboratory personnel successfully determined that the biological evidence from the two crime scenes originated from the same unidentified individual. This was a significant achievement. Rather than searching for two separate offenders, investigators could now concentrate their resources on identifying one person. Unfortunately, knowing that the same offender was responsible did not reveal who that individual was. Investigators compared the DNA profile against available records. No match. They continued collecting elimination samples from individuals who appeared relevant to the investigation. Again, no match. As the months became years, the case accumulated thousands of pages of documentation. Photographs. Laboratory reports. Interview transcripts. Search warrants. Investigative memoranda. Each represented another attempt to move the investigation forward. The media also played an important role. Local newspapers and television stations regularly reported on developments, hoping renewed public attention might encourage additional witnesses to come forward. It was during this period that the offender became widely known by the nickname, Canal Killer. While memorable, the label reflected the geographical connection between the crimes rather than any confirmed insight into the offender's identity or motivations. Public awareness increased substantially. Residents altered daily routines. Some avoided the canal paths after sunset altogether. Community organizations encouraged people to exercise in groups rather than alone. Police increased patrols in areas considered vulnerable. Although these measures were intended to improve public safety, they also demonstrated how profoundly two unsolved homicides had affected an entire city. Behind the scenes, investigators continued exploring every reasonable avenue. They examined offenders who had committed sexually motivated crimes. They reviewed reports involving attacks near recreational trails. They contacted law enforcement agencies outside Arizona to determine whether similar offenses had occurred elsewhere. Whenever a possible suspect emerged, detectives attempted to establish whether that individual could be connected through evidence, witness testimony, or forensic findings. Again and again, those possibilities were excluded. The investigation also faced an unavoidable challenge familiar to anyone who works long-term cold cases. Time changes evidence. Witnesses relocate. Memories become less precise. Businesses close. Records are destroyed according to retention policies. Neighborhoods evolve. Places that once looked entirely different become almost unrecognizable decades later. Every passing year complicated the search. Yet some aspects of the investigation remained remarkably stable. The preserved biological evidence continued to exist. Stored carefully under appropriate conditions, it represented the strongest piece of physical evidence available. Investigators understood that scientific progress might eventually allow more sophisticated testing than had been possible during the original investigation. For that reason, preserving the evidence became just as important as analyzing it. The detectives assigned to the case changed over time. Some retired. Others accepted promotions or transferred to different assignments. Each new investigator inherited not only the files but also the responsibility to continue pursuing answers for two families who had already waited far longer than anyone should. Cold case investigations often depend upon this continuity. The individuals may change. The commitment does not. Throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, advances in forensic science steadily improved the ability to analyze DNA. National databases expanded. Laboratory procedures became more sensitive. Computers accelerated comparisons that once required substantially more manual effort. Whenever meaningful technological improvements became available, investigators revisited the preserved evidence. Despite these advances, the offender remained unidentified. This absence of a match suggested several possibilities. The individual responsible might never have been convicted of an offense requiring DNA collection. He might have avoided detection entirely. Or he might simply not yet have entered any database accessible to investigators. Whatever the explanation, the evidence continued pointing toward someone who had successfully remained outside the reach of traditional investigative methods. By the end of the first decade of the 21st century, the Canal Killer investigation had become one of Phoenix's most prominent unsolved homicide cases. Many agencies might have accepted that the available evidence had reached its limits. The Phoenix investigators chose another path. Rather than closing the files, they continued searching for new methods capable of extracting additional information from evidence that had been preserved for nearly 2 decades. Around this time, developing investigative technique began attracting attention within the law enforcement community. Instead of asking whether an unknown DNA profile matched a known offender, researchers explored whether it might reveal biological relatives through genealogical analysis. The concept was innovative. It would require careful scientific work, extensive genealogical research, and traditional detective investigation working together. For the Canal Killer case, it represented something investigators had not possessed in many years. A genuinely new direction. The evidence had remained silent for nearly 20 years. Soon, advances in science would give investigators another opportunity to ask it the same question they had been asking since 1993. Who left this DNA behind? By the end of the first decade of the 21st century, the Canal Killer investigation had become one of the oldest active homicide cases in Phoenix. Nearly 20 years had passed since the murders of Angela Brosso and Melanie Berners. Entire generations of police officers had entered and left the department while the case remained unresolved. For the families, the passage of time did not lessen the loss. Birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays continued to arrive with the same unanswered questions that had existed in the early 1990s. Although detectives remained in contact whenever significant developments occurred, there were long periods during which there simply was no new information to report. Within law enforcement, however, the case was never considered forgotten. The original investigators had made one decision that would ultimately prove invaluable: they preserved the biological evidence recovered from both crime scenes according to the highest standards available at the time. Advances in forensic science throughout the late 1990s and 2000s repeatedly demonstrated the importance of careful evidence preservation, allowing laboratories to conduct increasingly sophisticated examinations using material collected decades earlier. In 2011, members of the Phoenix Police Department's Cold Case Unit undertook another comprehensive review of the investigation. Rather than merely revisiting old interviews, detectives approached the case as though they were seeing it for the first time. They reviewed investigative reports, crime scene documentation, laboratory findings, witness statements, and every significant lead that had previously been pursued. The central question remained unchanged. Who had left the DNA profile recovered from both homicide investigations? Traditional database comparisons had failed to produce an answer. The unknown profile did not correspond to anyone whose DNA had been entered into the National Criminal Database through qualifying convictions. Investigators therefore began examining an investigative method that was gaining attention within the forensic community: investigative genetic genealogy. Unlike conventional DNA matching, this approach does not search directly for the offender. Instead, it identifies biological relatives whose genetic information may be available through genealogy databases that permit law enforcement use under specific legal and policy frameworks. Genealogists then construct extensive family trees, narrowing possible candidates through historical records, public documents, age, geography, and other investigative information. The process is neither quick nor automatic. Every potential relationship must be carefully verified. Every family connection requires documentation. Traditional detective work remains essential throughout the investigation. For the Canal Killer case, this emerging methodology offered something investigators had lacked for decades: a new path forward. Working with forensic specialists and genealogical researchers, detectives gradually reduced the number of possible individuals who could account for the unknown DNA profile. The research ultimately directed investigators toward a particular family line. From there, traditional investigative techniques resumed. Detectives examined individuals whose age, location, and personal history aligned with the evidence collected over many years. One name increasingly attracted attention: Brian Patrick Miller. At that stage, however, suspicion alone carried no legal weight. Investigators understood that any future prosecution would require a direct forensic comparison between Miller's DNA and the biological evidence preserved from the two homicide investigations. Obtaining the comparison had to be accomplished lawfully and without alerting the suspect prematurely. Detectives therefore developed an undercover strategy. An investigator posed as a businessman interested in discussing potential employment opportunities with Miller. A meeting was arranged at a Chili's restaurant in Phoenix. The operation required careful planning. Investigators sought to ensure that any item later collected for DNA testing could confidently be attributed to Miller alone. Restaurant staff cooperated with law enforcement by providing unused dining utensils and a clean drinking glass before the meeting began, minimizing any possibility of contamination. The conversation itself appeared entirely ordinary. There was no arrest, no confrontation, no indication that the meeting concerned a homicide investigation stretching back more than 20 years. After the meeting concluded and Miller left the restaurant, investigators recovered the items he had used during the meal. Those objects were submitted for laboratory examination. Scientists extracted a DNA profile from the recovered material and compared it with the profile preserved from the murders of Angela Brosso and Melanie Berners. The result was conclusive. The profiles matched. For investigators who had devoted years of work to the case, the laboratory findings represented a turning point unlike any previous development. The unidentified offender was no longer unidentified. On January 13, 2015, Brian Patrick Miller was arrested. Even after his arrest, however, the legal process had only begun. As with any criminal prosecution in the United States, Miller was presumed innocent unless proven guilty in court. Prosecutors would need to present the evidence before a jury, while the defense would have the opportunity to challenge the investigation, the forensic findings, and the legal conclusions drawn from them. The arrest marked the end of one chapter of the Canal Killer investigation. It did not mark the end of the case itself. The coming years would involve extensive pretrial proceedings, forensic testimony, legal arguments, and psychiatric evaluations before the evidence collected over 2 decades could finally be presented in open court. For the families of Angela Brosso and Melanie Berners, the arrest represented an important milestone, but it was not yet the conclusion they had sought for so many years. The criminal justice process still had to determine whether the evidence established guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. After more than 2 decades of uncertainty, the search for the truth had entered its final stage. The arrest of Brian Patrick Miller on January 13, 2015, marked a major milestone in one of Arizona's longest-running homicide investigations. For many investigators, it represented the culmination of decades of work carried out by multiple generations of detectives, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and support personnel. Yet an arrest is not a conviction. The criminal justice process was only entering a new phase. Following his arrest, Miller was formally charged in connection with the murders of Angela Brosso and Melanie Berners, along with related offenses supported by the available evidence. As required under the American legal system, he was presumed innocent while awaiting trial. During interviews with investigators, Miller denied responsibility for the crimes. Public reporting indicated that he did not offer an explanation for why his DNA would be associated with the evidence collected during the homicide investigations, maintaining that he did not understand how such a result could have occurred. Because the prosecution intended to seek the death penalty if a conviction were obtained, the legal proceedings became particularly complex. Capital cases in the United States require extensive pre-trial litigation. Attorneys for both sides filed numerous motions concerning forensic evidence, witness testimony, expert opinions, and procedural issues. Courts reviewed scientific methods, evidentiary standards, and constitutional questions before a jury could ever hear the case. Another significant issue soon emerged. Defense attorneys argued that Miller suffered from serious mental illness and questioned whether he was competent to participate in the proceedings. Under American law, a defendant must be able to understand the nature of the charges and assist legal counsel in preparing a defense. Competency is separate from questions regarding criminal responsibility at the time of the offense. The court therefore ordered multiple psychological and psychiatric evaluations. Mental health professionals interviewed Miller, reviewed medical records, and prepared reports for the court. Experts retained by both the prosecution and the defense sometimes reached different conclusions, leading to additional hearings and further evaluations. These proceedings contributed to lengthy delays. For the victims' families, the repeated postponements were understandably difficult. More than 20 years had already passed before an arrest was made. The additional years required to resolve competency issues extended an already extraordinarily long search for legal resolution. Despite these delays, the preserved forensic evidence remained central to the prosecution's case. Advances in DNA science had identified Miller as the source of biological evidence recovered during both homicide investigations. Prosecutors argued that this evidence, combined with the broader investigative record, established a compelling factual basis for the charges. The defense, meanwhile, exercised its right to examine every aspect of the forensic work. Experts reviewed laboratory procedures, evidence handling, chain of custody documentation, and scientific methodology. Such scrutiny is common in major criminal trials, particularly those involving DNA evidence and potential capital punishment. The years preceding trial also reflected how significantly criminal investigations had evolved since the early 1990s. When the murders occurred, DNA profiling was still relatively new and available databases were limited. By the time Miller's case approached trial, forensic genetics had become one of the most reliable forms of scientific evidence used in criminal courts. Investigators who had preserved biological evidence decades earlier had done so with the hope that future technology might provide answers. In this case, that decision proved decisive. The Canal Killer investigation also attracted national attention because of the role played by investigative genetic genealogy during the renewed inquiry. Although DNA recovered from the crime scenes ultimately provided the direct evidentiary match, genealogical analysis helped investigators narrow the field of possible suspects after traditional methods had failed. The case therefore became part of a broader discussion within the forensic and legal communities about how emerging technologies could assist in solving cold cases while remaining subject to judicial oversight and constitutional protections. Throughout the pre-trial period, prosecutors continued preparing witnesses. detectives who had worked the original investigation reviewed decades-old reports. Crime scene specialists revisited photographs and physical evidence. Laboratory scientists prepared to explain complex forensic procedures in language understandable to jurors. Meanwhile, attorneys for the defense developed arguments concerning mental health, evidentiary interpretation, and the legal standards governing criminal responsibility. By 2022, after years of litigation and competency proceedings, the case was finally ready for trial. For the families of Angela Brosso and Melanie Berners, the courtroom represented something they had waited nearly 3 decades to see. It was not an opportunity to erase the past, nothing could accomplish that, but it was the first chance for the evidence gathered over so many years to be presented publicly before a jury. The proceedings that followed would bring together testimony from investigators, forensic scientists, expert witnesses, and others whose work had spanned almost 30 years. Their collective efforts would ask the jury to answer the central question that had remained unresolved since 1993, whether the evidence proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Brian Patrick Miller was responsible for the murders of Angela Brosso and Melanie Berners. When the trial finally began in 2022, it marked the culmination of nearly 3 decades of investigative work. Few criminal cases remain active for such a long period before reaching a jury, and the Canal Killer case reflected both the persistence of law enforcement and the evolution of forensic science. For the families of Angela Brosso and Melanie Berners, entering the courtroom carried enormous emotional weight. Many of the events under discussion had taken place almost 30 years earlier, yet the loss remained immediate in its impact. Throughout the proceedings, the focus for many family members was not simply on securing a conviction but on seeing the evidence examined publicly after decades of uncertainty. The prosecution presented the case as the result of a long-term investigation in which scientific advances had finally allowed preserved evidence to identify the offender. Prosecutors called investigators, forensic specialists, crime laboratory personnel, and other witnesses who explained how the evidence had been collected, preserved, and analyzed over many years. A central component of the prosecution's case was DNA evidence. Experts described the biological material recovered during the homicide investigations and explained how advances in forensic testing eventually allowed investigators to compare that evidence with DNA obtained from Brian Patrick Miller. They testified that the laboratory analyses identified Miller as the source of the DNA associated with both investigations. The prosecution also outlined the chronology of the renewed investigation, including the use of investigative genetic genealogy as an investigative lead and the subsequent undercover operation in which detectives lawfully obtained items used by Miller for confirmatory DNA testing. Jurors heard testimony regarding the methods used to preserve evidence, maintain chain of custody, and conduct laboratory examinations according to accepted forensic standards. The defense did not dispute that extensive scientific work had been performed. Instead, defense counsel focused significant attention on Miller's mental health. Over several years, psychologists and psychiatrists had evaluated him to determine competency and other issues relevant to the proceedings. During trial, expert witnesses discussed those evaluations, offering differing opinions concerning his psychological condition. As in many criminal trials involving complex forensic evidence and mental health testimony, jurors were required to evaluate multiple categories of evidence rather than relying on a single witness or exhibit. The court instructed the jury regarding the applicable legal standards, emphasizing that the prosecution bore the burden of proving every element of the charged offenses beyond a reasonable doubt. The proceedings extended over several months. Witnesses included detectives from different stages of the investigation, forensic scientists who explained laboratory findings, and expert witnesses called by both sides. Documentary evidence, photographs, investigative records, and scientific reports were introduced to help jurors understand an investigation that had unfolded across nearly 3 decades. The passage of time itself became an important feature of the trial. Investigators explained how technological limitations during the early 1990s had prevented earlier identification of the offender despite the preservation of valuable biological evidence. Advances in DNA analysis and investigative genetic genealogy ultimately provided opportunities that had not existed when the crimes were originally investigated. In April 2023, after considering the evidence presented throughout the trial, the jury returned its verdict. Brian Patrick Miller was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder in connection with the deaths of Angela Brosso and Melanie Berners. The jury also found him guilty of additional offenses related to the crimes, consistent with the evidence presented during the proceedings. The verdict concluded one phase of the judicial process but did not immediately determine the sentence. Because prosecutors had sought capital punishment, the case proceeded to a separate sentencing phase in accordance with Arizona law. During this stage, the court considered aggravating and mitigating circumstances before determining the appropriate sentence. In June 2023, the court sentenced Brian Patrick Miller to death. For investigators who had worked on the case across different decades, the sentencing represented the formal conclusion of one of Arizona's longest-running homicide investigations. Many detectives who had contributed to the original inquiry had already retired, and some were no longer alive to witness the outcome. Nevertheless, the investigation they began had ultimately reached a legal resolution. For the families of Angela Brosso and Melanie Berners, the verdict and sentence could not undo the losses they had experienced. Courts can determine criminal responsibility and impose lawful punishment, but they cannot restore lives that have been taken or erase years of grief. The Canal Killer case has since become an important example in discussions of cold case investigations. It illustrates how careful evidence preservation, continued investigative commitment, and advances in forensic science can contribute to resolving cases that once appeared unlikely ever to be solved. It also serves as a reminder that many unanswered investigations remain active across the United States. As forensic technology continues to develop, evidence collected years or even decades earlier may provide opportunities for investigators to revisit cases that previously lacked sufficient leads. The resolution of this case was therefore significant not only for the families directly affected but also for the broader field of criminal investigation. It demonstrated that, even after many years, carefully preserved evidence can retain its value and that persistent investigative work may eventually provide answers that once seemed beyond reach. With the sentencing of Brian Patrick Miller in 2023, one of Arizona's longest-running homicide investigations reached its legal conclusion. For the criminal justice system, the case had moved from an unsolved mystery to a resolved prosecution. For the families of Angela Brosso and Melanie Berners, however, the end of the trial did not mark the end of their experience. Loss does not follow the timetable of a court proceeding. Nearly 30 years had passed between the murders and the verdict. During that time, parents grew older, siblings built families of their own, careers began and ended, and entire generations came to know the victims only through photographs and memories shared by those who loved them. The criminal case answered one fundamental question: who was legally responsible for the murders for which Brian Patrick Miller was convicted? It could not answer every question the families still carried. Like many long-running homicide investigations, the Canal Killer case left investigators with issues that extended beyond the courtroom. Detectives have stated publicly that they examined whether Miller might be connected to other unsolved crimes in Arizona, including the 1992 disappearance of 13-year-old Brandy Myers. To date, however, he has not been convicted in connection with those matters, and no court has found him criminally responsible for additional homicides beyond those involving Angela Brosso and Melanie Berners. Those unresolved questions illustrate an important distinction in criminal investigations. Investigators may continue exploring possible connections based on available information, but criminal responsibility requires evidence sufficient to satisfy the legal standards of prosecution and proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Not every suspicion becomes a criminal charge. Not every investigation results in a conviction. The Canal Killer case also occupies a significant place in the history of forensic science. When the murders occurred in the early 1990s, DNA technology was still developing. Detectives preserved biological evidence believing that future scientific advances might someday provide additional answers. That decision proved decisive. As forensic techniques improved over the following decades, evidence that had remained silent during the original investigation became increasingly informative. Ultimately, investigative genetic genealogy helped generate a lead, while conventional DNA comparison provided the evidentiary confirmation used in court. Today, investigators throughout the United States continue applying similar approaches to cold cases involving homicide, unidentified human remains, and long-term missing persons investigations. Each case is evaluated individually under applicable legal and scientific standards, but the Canal Killer investigation demonstrated the potential value of combining traditional detective work with emerging forensic methods. The case also highlights another enduring lesson. Cold cases are rarely solved by one breakthrough alone. Instead, they are usually resolved through the accumulation of many careful decisions made over years or even decades. Crime scene investigators preserve evidence correctly. Laboratory scientists maintain rigorous documentation. Detectives organize files so future investigators can understand earlier work. Prosecutors prepare cases that may not reach trial for many years. Each step, although seemingly routine, contributes to the possibility of eventual resolution. Another important aspect of the case concerns public perception. Following Miller's arrest, considerable attention focused on the contrast between his public activities and the crimes for which he was later convicted. Media reports described his participation in community events while portraying a fictional, zombie hunter, character. Although this contrast attracted widespread attention, investigators emphasized that the case was built on forensic evidence and investigative work rather than public impressions or appearances. Criminal investigations rely upon evidence, not assumptions. That principle remained central throughout the prosecution. The victims' families have consistently remained the most important voices in understanding the human impact of the case. Angela Brosso and Melanie Berners were remembered by relatives and friends not because of the investigation itself, but because of the lives they lived before becoming victims of violent crime. Their names continue to be associated with efforts to improve public awareness of cold case investigations and the importance of preserving evidence that may one day assist future scientific analysis. The Canal Killer investigation is therefore remembered for several reasons. It represents the persistence of investigators who refuse to abandon an unsolved case. It demonstrates the value of advances in forensic genetics. It illustrates how careful evidence preservation can influence investigations decades later. Most importantly, it reminds us that behind every case file are real people whose absence continues to shape the lives of those who knew them. True crime stories often attract attention because they involve mystery, investigation, and courtroom proceedings. Yet the lasting significance of cases such as this lies elsewhere. They remind us of the responsibility carried by investigators, forensic scientists, prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, and juries to ensure that criminal proceedings remain grounded in evidence, fairness, and due process. They also remind us that justice, even when achieved after many years, cannot erase tragedy. It can establish accountability. It can acknowledge the facts proven in court. It can provide answers that families have sought for decades. But it cannot restore the years that were lost. The story of the Canal Killer investigation ultimately became one of perseverance rather than inevitability. There was no single dramatic breakthrough that solved the case overnight. Instead, progress resulted from decades of patient investigative work, scientific innovation, and the determination of individuals who believed that even the oldest evidence deserved another examination. For future investigators, the case serves as a model of why cold cases should not be dismissed simply because time has passed. For the public, it offers a deeper understanding of how modern forensic science can assist criminal investigations while operating within legal safeguards. And for the memory of Angela Brosso and Melanie Berners, it stands as a reminder that they should be remembered first as young women whose lives mattered, not only as victims in a famous criminal case, but as people whose stories continue to inspire the pursuit of justice long after the headlines have faded. Although the criminal proceedings concluded in 2023, the Canal Killer case continues to influence discussions within law enforcement, forensic science, and the criminal justice system. It is now frequently referenced as an example of how long-term investigations can benefit from advances in technology while also demonstrating the importance of preserving evidence and maintaining investigative continuity. One of the clearest lessons from the case concerns evidence preservation. When investigators processed the homicide scenes in the early 1990s, they could not know what forensic techniques would become available decades later. Nevertheless, they collected, documented, and stored biological evidence according to the best practices of the time. That decision ultimately allowed later investigators to apply more advanced DNA analysis and investigative genetic genealogy methods that did not exist in their modern form when the crimes occurred. The case therefore illustrates an important principle shared across forensic disciplines. Evidence collected today may answer questions that current technology cannot yet resolve. For this reason, crime laboratories and law enforcement agencies place significant emphasis on maintaining proper chain of custody, secure storage, and detailed documentation. These procedures may appear administrative, but they are fundamental to ensuring that evidence remains reliable years or even decades after a crime has occurred. The investigation also demonstrated the importance of institutional continuity. During the nearly 30 years between the murders and the verdict, numerous detectives, forensic scientists, supervisors, and prosecutors contributed to the case. Some retired before an arrest was made. Others inherited the investigation long after the original crime scenes had been processed. Cold case work depends on careful record-keeping. Each investigator must understand not only what has already been done but also why particular decisions were made. Well-organized files, comprehensive reports, and preserved evidence allow future investigators to continue work without repeating unnecessary steps or overlooking significant information. The Canal Killer investigation benefited from that continuity. Every generation of investigators added to the work of those who came before. Another lasting impact of the case concerns investigative genetic genealogy. Although this methodology has become increasingly well known in recent years, its use remains subject to legal, ethical, and scientific considerations. Agencies employing the technique generally do so within established legal frameworks and in conjunction with traditional investigative methods. Importantly, genealogical analysis does not itself establish criminal guilt. Instead, it functions as an investigative lead. Detectives must still identify potential suspects through conventional investigation, obtain legally admissible DNA samples, and compare those samples using accepted forensic laboratory procedures. In the Canal Killer investigation, genealogical research narrowed the field of possible suspects, but the prosecution ultimately relied upon direct DNA comparisons and other admissible evidence presented during trial. This distinction remains important in discussions of modern forensic practice. The case has also contributed to public understanding of cold case investigations. Popular culture often portrays criminal investigations as rapid processes in which major cases are solved within days. In reality, many homicide investigations remain active for years or decades. Progress may occur slowly as new witnesses come forward, scientific methods improve, or previously unavailable information becomes accessible. The Canal Killer investigation reflects that reality. The eventual resolution did not result from a single dramatic discovery. It resulted from sustained investigative effort combined with advances in forensic science. For the families of Angela Brosso and Melanie Berners, the legal proceedings represented an important milestone, but they also highlighted the emotional complexity of long-delayed justice. After nearly 3 decades, memories of the victims remained vivid within their families even as the broader public had gradually become familiar with the case primarily through media coverage. The distinction matters. High-profile criminal cases often become associated with the offender's name or nickname. Families, however, continue to remember birthdays, conversations, achievements, and ordinary moments that existed long before the crime occurred. Maintaining that perspective helps ensure that public discussion remains centered on the individuals whose lives were lost rather than on those responsible for the crimes. The Canal Killer investigation has therefore become part of a broader movement within criminal justice and journalism to emphasize victims' lives alongside investigative developments. Many modern true crime documentaries and educational programs now seek to balance discussion of forensic evidence and investigative strategy with respectful attention to the people affected by violent crime. The case also serves as a reminder that some questions may remain unanswered even after a successful prosecution. Law enforcement has publicly acknowledged that investigators examined whether Brian Patrick Miller might have been connected to additional crimes. To date, however, no further homicide convictions have resulted from those inquiries. This outcome reflects an essential feature of the legal system. Investigative interest alone does not establish criminal responsibility. Each case must be supported by evidence sufficient to meet the applicable legal standards before charges can be filed and convictions obtained. As forensic technology continues to evolve, investigators across the United States continue reviewing unsolved cases using methods unavailable when many crimes originally occurred. Some investigations result in arrests. Others eliminate long-standing suspects. Still others remain unresolved despite renewed examination. The Canal Killer case demonstrates both the possibilities and the limitations of modern forensic science. Technology can generate new leads and strengthen evidence, but successful investigations continue to depend upon careful detective work, lawful procedures, scientific integrity, and judicial oversight. Ultimately, the lasting significance of this case extends beyond one prosecution. It reinforces the importance of preserving evidence, supporting long-term investigations, and continuing to invest in forensic research that may provide future investigators with tools unavailable today. Most importantly, it reminds us that behind every cold case are families who continue waiting for answers, regardless of how many years have passed. The pursuit of justice in the Canal Killer investigation required extraordinary patience. Its resolution stands as an example of what can be achieved when scientific progress and persistent investigative work come together in service of the truth. The resolution of the Canal Killer investigation has become an important case study for law enforcement agencies, forensic laboratories, and criminal justice professionals throughout the United States. While every investigation is unique, the case demonstrates several principles that continue to shape modern homicide investigations and cold case reviews. Perhaps the most significant lesson concerns patience. Criminal investigations are often portrayed as rapid and decisive, particularly in fictional television programs. In reality, many homicide cases require months, years, or even decades before sufficient evidence becomes available to identify a suspect. Scientific progress does not always occur on the timetable investigators would prefer, and successful prosecutions frequently depend upon evidence that has been carefully preserved long before new analytical methods are developed. The detectives who investigated the Canal Killer case in the early 1990s could not have anticipated the emergence of investigative genetic genealogy. Nevertheless, their commitment to collecting and preserving biological evidence ensured that future investigators would have material suitable for more advanced testing. That foresight became one of the defining strengths of the investigation. Another important lesson involves collaboration. The successful prosecution of Brian Patrick Miller did not result from the efforts of a single investigator or laboratory. Instead, it reflected the combined work of homicide detectives, crime scene specialists, forensic scientists, prosecutors, genealogical researchers, laboratory technicians, and numerous support personnel whose contributions extended across nearly 3 decades. Large criminal investigations often require precisely this type of interdisciplinary cooperation. Each participant contributes specialized expertise. Crime scene investigators document physical evidence. Laboratory scientists analyze biological material. Detectives interview witnesses and evaluate investigative leads. Prosecutors ensure that evidence is prepared for presentation in court according to applicable legal standards. The Canal Killer case illustrates how these separate responsibilities ultimately support a common objective, determining the facts through lawful investigation. The investigation also highlights the importance of maintaining professional skepticism. During the decades in which the case remained unsolved, investigators received numerous tips from members of the public. Many appeared promising initially but were ultimately excluded after careful examination. This process is both necessary and expected. Investigators must evaluate every credible lead while avoiding premature conclusions. Careful elimination of incorrect suspects is as important as identifying the correct one. Modern forensic science further reinforces this principle. DNA evidence is a powerful investigative tool, but it must always be interpreted within the broader context of the case. Biological evidence establishes scientific relationships between individuals and evidence recovered during an investigation. It does not replace the need for comprehensive investigative work, proper legal procedures, or judicial review. The Canal Killer prosecution demonstrated this balance. Investigative genetic genealogy generated an investigative lead. Traditional police work identified and evaluated the suspect. Lawfully obtained DNA provided direct forensic comparison. The courts then evaluated the admissibility and significance of that evidence through established legal procedures. Each stage depended upon the one before it. Another lasting lesson concerns the evolution of cold case investigations. Historically, many unsolved homicide cases eventually became inactive because available investigative methods had been exhausted. Today, however, agencies increasingly recognize that scientific developments may justify periodic reviews of older investigations. Advances in DNA analysis, digital record management, forensic genealogy, and laboratory technology continue creating opportunities to revisit evidence collected years earlier. For that reason, many police departments now maintain dedicated cold case units whose responsibilities include reviewing unsolved investigations in light of emerging scientific capabilities. The Canal Killer investigation has often been cited as an example of why those efforts remain worthwhile. It also demonstrates the importance of public confidence in the criminal justice system. High-profile cases attract substantial media attention, making transparency and adherence to legal procedures particularly important. Throughout the prosecution, the courts addressed evidentiary issues, competency proceedings, expert testimony, and sentencing according to established legal processes. Such safeguards are essential regardless of the seriousness of the allegations. The legitimacy of criminal convictions depends not only upon identifying the correct offender but also upon ensuring that investigations and prosecutions comply with constitutional protections and procedural fairness. The case additionally contributed to broader public discussions regarding forensic genealogy. As the methodology has become more widely known, legal scholars, scientists, and policymakers have examined questions concerning privacy, database participation, and appropriate investigative safeguards. Although opinions differ regarding particular policy issues, there is broad agreement that the technology should be employed within clearly defined legal frameworks and subject to judicial oversight where required. The Canal Killer investigation therefore occupies an important place in the continuing evolution of forensic practice. Perhaps the most enduring lesson, however, concerns the victims themselves. Over time, public attention naturally shifts toward investigative breakthroughs, courtroom proceedings, and scientific developments. Yet the original purpose of every homicide investigation remains constant: to seek accountability for the unlawful taking of human life. Angela Brosso and Melanie Bernas are remembered today not only because their case contributed to advances in forensic investigation, but because they were two young women whose futures were permanently interrupted. The investigation sought answers on their behalf. The prosecution sought accountability under the law. The scientific advances demonstrated what determined investigators can accomplish when evidence is preserved and carefully re-examined. Their case continues to be studied by investigators, forensic professionals, legal scholars, and students of criminal justice because it illustrates how persistence, science, and careful adherence to legal process can ultimately resolve even investigations that once appeared unlikely ever to reach a courtroom. The Canal Killer investigation reminds us that justice is often measured not by speed, but by diligence. It is the product of countless decisions made carefully over many years, guided by evidence rather than assumption, and by the continuing commitment to uncover the truth wherever that evidence may lead. When people study the Canal Killer case today, they often focus on the forensic breakthrough that ultimately identified Brian Patrick Miller. Investigative genetic genealogy, DNA evidence, and the lengthy criminal proceedings have become central topics in discussions of the case. Those developments are significant, but they should not overshadow the individuals whose lives were permanently changed by the crimes. Every homicide investigation extends far beyond the victim. Families experience an immediate loss that continues long after media attention fades. Friends, co-workers, classmates, neighbors, and investigators themselves may also carry lasting memories of a case that remains unresolved for many years. In the Canal Killer investigation, nearly 3 decades separated the crimes from the verdict. During those years, the families of Angela Brosso and Melanie Berners continued living ordinary lives while carrying extraordinary grief. Time moved forward, but the absence of their loved ones remained constant. Birthdays arrived. Holidays were celebrated. Family photographs grew larger as new generations were born. Yet 2 places within those family histories could never be filled. This reality is common in long-term homicide investigations. Justice obtained many years later may answer legal questions, but it cannot restore missed experiences or replace relationships that were lost. For investigators, cold cases also carry a unique emotional dimension. Detectives often speak of the responsibility they feel toward victims whose cases remain unsolved. Although assignments change and careers progress, particularly significant investigations are rarely forgotten. In long-running cases, responsibility may pass from one generation of investigators to another. The original detectives document every interview, preserve every exhibit, and record every investigative decision with the understanding that someone else may eventually continue the work. Success therefore depends upon continuity. The Canal Killer investigation reflected exactly that process. Over nearly 30 years, numerous professionals contributed to the case. Crime scene investigators preserved evidence. Laboratory scientists analyzed biological material. Detectives pursued leads. Cold case specialists revisited earlier conclusions. Genealogical researchers assisted in identifying new investigative directions. Prosecutors prepared the evidence for court. Each contribution represented one part of a much larger effort. The investigation also illustrates the importance of scientific progress in modern criminal justice. When the crimes occurred, available DNA technology could establish certain facts but could not identify the offender through existing databases. Rather than abandoning the investigation, law enforcement preserved the evidence with the expectation that future developments might expand forensic capabilities. That expectation proved correct. Scientific innovation transformed evidence collected in the early 1990s into evidence capable of supporting a criminal prosecution decades later. The case has therefore become part of educational programs for investigators and forensic professionals studying cold case methodology. Students of criminal justice frequently examine the investigation to understand how careful evidence preservation, comprehensive documentation, and technological advancement can interact over extended periods. At the same time, the Canal Killer case serves as a reminder that technology alone cannot solve crimes. Investigative decisions remain essential. Scientists may identify a biological profile. Detectives must determine whose profile it is. Prosecutors must present admissible evidence. Courts must evaluate that evidence under established legal standards. Jurors must determine whether guilt has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Each stage performs a different function within the justice system. Another lasting lesson concerns public memory. High-profile criminal cases sometimes become associated primarily with the offender's name or a media-generated nickname. While such labels may simplify reporting, they can unintentionally shift attention away from those most affected by the crime. For that reason, many victim advocates encourage continued emphasis on the lives of the victims rather than the notoriety of the offender. Angela Brosso and Melanie Berners were remembered by those who knew them long before the investigation became nationally recognized. Their families have consistently emphasized that their identities should not be reduced solely to the circumstances of their deaths. Remembering victims as complete individuals helps preserve the human perspective that should remain central to every criminal investigation. The Canal Killer case also continues to influence discussions regarding unresolved investigations. Across the United States, thousands of homicide cases remain open. Many involve biological evidence collected years before current forensic methods became available. As laboratory techniques continue improving, investigators periodically review these older cases to determine whether renewed testing may provide additional information. Not every review results in an arrest. Some eliminate long-standing suspects. Others identify previously unknown individuals. Many remain unresolved despite extensive efforts. Nevertheless, the Canal Killer investigation demonstrates why law enforcement agencies continue investing time and resources in cold case investigations. History has shown that evidence preserved decades earlier may eventually provide answers that once seemed impossible. The case ultimately represents more than the successful prosecution of one individual. It reflects the combined efforts of investigators who refused to abandon an unsolved case, scientists who developed increasingly sophisticated forensic methods, legal professionals who ensured the evidence was examined according to established procedures, and families who continued hoping for answers despite the passage of many years. Justice, in this instance, required extraordinary patience. It also required confidence that truth can sometimes remain hidden for decades before scientific progress allows investigators to uncover it. The legacy of the Canal Killer investigation therefore extends beyond Arizona. It continues to influence forensic practice, cold case methodology, and criminal justice education while reminding investigators everywhere that careful work performed today may become the foundation for solving tomorrow's oldest mysteries. Most importantly, it reinforces a principle shared across every homicide investigation: the pursuit of justice is ultimately undertaken not for the case file itself, but for the people whose lives have been forever changed by crime. In the years following the conviction of Brian Patrick Miller, the Canal Killer investigation became more than a solved homicide case. It became a reference point for detectives, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and criminal justice educators studying how modern technology can assist investigations that once appeared impossible to solve. One reason the case continues to receive attention is the extraordinary length of time between the crimes and the conviction. More than 30 years separated the murders from the final sentencing. During that period, the world changed dramatically. Computers became central to criminal investigations. DNA profiling evolved from a relatively new scientific technique into one of the most reliable forms of forensic evidence available to law enforcement. Digital record systems replaced many paper archives. Investigators gained access to analytical tools that detectives in the early 1990s could scarcely have imagined. Yet despite all of those advances, one element remained unchanged: the biological evidence collected during the original investigation. Without the careful work performed by crime scene investigators in 1992 and 1993, later scientific breakthroughs would have had nothing to examine. That reality has become one of the central educational lessons associated with the Canal Killer case. Evidence preservation is not simply an administrative responsibility. It is an investment in future justice. Many police academies and forensic training programs now emphasize that investigators should collect and preserve evidence with the understanding that scientific capabilities will continue evolving throughout their careers. The Canal Killer investigation illustrates why that philosophy matters. Another enduring contribution of the case involves investigative genetic genealogy. Before this methodology became widely known, investigators generally relied upon direct comparisons between unknown DNA profiles and existing criminal databases. If the offender had never submitted DNA through a qualifying criminal conviction or another lawful process, the investigation could remain stalled indefinitely. Genetic genealogy introduced a different approach. Rather than asking whether investigators already possessed the offender's DNA profile, researchers examined whether distant biological relatives could provide investigative leads. The process did not replace traditional police work. Instead, it expanded the range of available investigative strategies. The Canal Killer investigation demonstrated that genealogical research could identify promising leads even when conventional database searches produced no results. Nevertheless, law enforcement agencies continue emphasizing an important limitation. Genealogical information itself does not establish criminal responsibility. Every lead must be confirmed through independent investigation and legally admissible forensic evidence. That safeguard protects both the integrity of investigations and the rights of individuals whose names may arise during genealogical research. The case also encouraged renewed attention to cold case units across the United States. Historically, Many departments lack personnel dedicated exclusively to reviewing older homicide investigations. As forensic science advanced, however, agencies increasingly recognized that unsolved cases deserved periodic re-examination. Cold case investigators often approach historical files with fresh perspectives. They review evidence collected decades earlier using technologies unavailable during the original investigation. They re-interview witnesses whose willingness to speak may have changed over time. They examine investigative assumptions in light of new scientific understanding. The Canal Killer investigation illustrates how valuable those reviews can become. Another lasting impact concerns cooperation among different professional disciplines. The successful resolution of the case depended upon effective communication between detectives, laboratory scientists, genealogists, prosecutors, and the courts. Each discipline contributed specialized expertise. Investigators gathered facts. Scientists interpreted evidence. Legal professionals ensured that constitutional protections and evidentiary standards were maintained throughout the proceedings. The result was a prosecution supported by both scientific analysis and established legal procedure. This collaborative model has become increasingly common in major cold case investigations. Modern criminal investigations frequently involve professionals whose backgrounds include biology, chemistry, genealogy, digital forensics, psychology, law, and criminal analysis. The Canal Killer case demonstrated the value of combining those areas of expertise. The investigation also serves as a reminder that criminal justice extends beyond scientific achievement. Forensic breakthroughs receive considerable public attention because they are innovative and often highly technical. Yet every successful prosecution ultimately depends upon human judgment. Investigators must decide which leads deserve additional attention. Prosecutors must determine whether available evidence satisfies legal standards. Judges must evaluate admissibility. Jurors must weigh testimony carefully before reaching a verdict. Technology supports those decisions. It does not replace them. The victims' families remain an equally important part of the case's legacy. Although media coverage frequently emphasized scientific developments and courtroom proceedings, the families continued emphasizing the importance of remembering Angela Brosso and Melanie Berners as individuals whose lives extended far beyond the criminal investigation. Their perspective has influenced broader discussions within journalism and documentary filmmaking regarding responsible reporting on violent crime. Increasingly, documentary producers seek to balance discussion of investigative methods with respectful attention to victims and survivors. The Canal Killer investigation reflects that evolving approach. The story is significant not because it features an unusual offender or a particularly lengthy investigation. It is significant because it demonstrates what determined professionals can accomplish when they remain committed to the pursuit of truth despite years of uncertainty. It also reminds us that justice is rarely immediate. Sometimes the most important investigative decision is not discovering new evidence. Sometimes it is preserving existing evidence carefully enough that future generations may discover what earlier investigators could not. That principle continues guiding cold case investigations throughout the United States. As forensic science develops further, additional unsolved cases may benefit from methods that are only beginning to emerge today. The Canal Killer investigation therefore remains relevant not only as a chapter in Arizona's criminal justice history but also as an example of how patience, scientific progress, and careful investigative practice can converge to resolve cases that once appeared destined to remain unsolved. Its greatest legacy lies not in the notoriety of the offender, but in the demonstration that evidence, when preserved with care and examined with integrity, can continue speaking long after decades of silence. Years after the conviction and sentencing of Brian Patrick Miller, the Canal Killer investigation continues to be studied for reasons that extend well beyond the outcome of a single criminal prosecution. While the legal proceedings concluded in court, the broader significance of the case remains relevant to investigators, forensic scientists, legal scholars, and educators examining how major cold cases evolve over time. One reason the investigation receives continued attention is its demonstration of institutional persistence. Many homicide investigations remain active for decades without producing an arrest. During that period, personnel inevitably change. Detectives retire, laboratory scientists move into new positions, prosecutors leave public service, and supervisors are replaced by new leadership. Without careful documentation and evidence management, important information can easily become fragmented. The Canal Killer investigation illustrates the opposite. The case files were maintained in a manner that allowed successive generations of investigators to understand what had already been accomplished, what evidence remained available, and which investigative strategies had previously been explored. That continuity reduced duplication of effort and allowed later investigators to build upon, rather than restart, the work of their predecessors. The investigation also reinforced the importance of adapting to scientific progress. When the crimes occurred in the early 1990s, DNA analysis represented a promising but still developing forensic discipline. Laboratories could establish important biological relationships, yet many investigative tools now considered routine had not been developed or widely implemented. Over the following decades, improvements in laboratory techniques increased the amount of information obtainable from preserved biological material. Investigative genetic genealogy added another potential avenue for identifying previously unknown suspects. None of these developments altered the underlying evidence. Instead, they expanded investigators' ability to interpret evidence that had already been collected. This distinction remains important. Scientific advances cannot compensate for evidence that was never preserved. Conversely, carefully preserved evidence may become increasingly valuable as analytical methods improve. Another important lesson concerns investigative discipline. High-profile cases often generate thousands of public tips. Some contain useful information. Many do not. Investigators must evaluate each lead objectively, documenting the results regardless of whether the information ultimately proves relevant. Throughout the Canal Killer investigation, detectives examined numerous possible suspects over many years. Individuals were evaluated, evidence was compared, and investigative theories were tested against available facts. Most possibilities were eliminated through ordinary police work before the investigation ultimately focused on Brian Patrick Miller. This methodical approach demonstrates an essential principle of criminal investigation: conclusions should follow evidence rather than assumptions. The case has likewise contributed to discussions surrounding the responsible use of forensic genealogy. As the methodology has become more widely available, legal and ethical questions have accompanied its expansion. Public policy discussions continue regarding privacy, informed participation in genealogy databases, judicial oversight, and the circumstances under which genealogical research should be employed in criminal investigations. The Canal Killer investigation is frequently referenced within those discussions because it illustrates both the potential benefits and the importance of maintaining established legal safeguards. Investigative genealogy generated a lead. Traditional detective work evaluated that lead. Direct forensic comparison provided admissible scientific evidence. Judicial proceedings determined whether that evidence satisfied the legal standard required for conviction. Each stage remained subject to established legal procedures. The investigation has also influenced public understanding of cold cases. Many people assume that an unsolved homicide gradually becomes inactive simply because time passes. In practice, many law enforcement agencies periodically review older investigations whenever meaningful technological or scientific developments occur. The Canal Killer case demonstrates why those reviews remain worthwhile. Although decades had passed, preserved evidence continued to retain investigative value. As scientific capabilities expanded, that evidence ultimately contributed to identifying the offender responsible for the crimes for which Miller was convicted. Equally important is the perspective offered by the victims' families. Throughout media coverage of the case, relatives consistently sought to ensure that public attention remained focused on Angela Brosso and Melanie Berners rather than solely on the offender or the forensic techniques involved. That perspective reflects a broader movement within criminal justice and journalism to place victims at the center of public discussion. Investigative success should ultimately be measured not by the notoriety of an offender but by the pursuit of accountability on behalf of those who suffered harm. The Canal Killer investigation therefore represents several different stories simultaneously. It is the story of determined investigators who continued working an unsolved case despite years of limited progress. It is the story of scientific advancement that transformed preserved evidence into powerful forensic information. It is the story of a legal process that carefully examined that evidence before reaching a verdict. Most importantly, it is the story of two young women whose lives continue to be remembered through the enduring efforts to achieve justice on their behalf. Today, the investigation is regularly cited in discussions of evidence preservation, forensic genetics, cold case methodology, and interdisciplinary cooperation within law enforcement. It serves as an example of how careful investigative work performed decades earlier can retain extraordinary value when combined with future scientific innovation. Its enduring legacy is therefore not simply that an old case was solved. Rather, it demonstrates that justice sometimes depends upon patience, meticulous documentation, scientific integrity, and the willingness of investigators to revisit unanswered questions long after public attention has faded. For criminal justice professionals, the Canal Killer case remains a reminder that the passage of time does not necessarily diminish the possibility of accountability. When evidence is preserved, investigative records are maintained, and new forensic methods are applied responsibly, even the oldest investigations may still yield meaningful answers.